All right, guys. So today we're going to be discussing a portion of a lesson designed to be at the end of the third unit in Grade 8 Social Studies. Grade 8 Social Studies encompasses the Renaissance, the Japanese during the Edo period, and the Aztec. And so we're going to do an exercise involving Venn diagrams, discussing the differences and similarities of the Aztec and the Spanish people. So what I might ask from you guys first is, what do you guys know about the Aztec people?
They had a Spanish.
Oh, no. Eventually, yes, they did speak Spanish after a couple hundred years of subjugation, but not for the time period we're talking about.
A lot of natural resources for gold and silver.
All right, so let's say wealth. Put wealth under an overlapping category here. The Spanish and the Aztec, because both the Spanish and the Aztec were fairly wealthy. Anything else?
They made pyramids.
Pyramids. All right. So let's do elaborate architecture. I'm going to abbreviate that there. Anything else? Anybody got any other ideas about the Aztec? Jesse? No? Nothing? All right, no, that's okay. So some of the ideas I had for the Aztec were many gods. All right, so that's called polytheism. Poly meaning multiple, theism having to do with gods. I also had that they had a more of a land-based empire. So they had a very vast empire, right? We've discussed this. And that empire was largely over land. There was no overseas expansion, right? And they also went to war for religious reasons, right? So over the course of the 8th grade social studies curriculum, you discuss, they're a very violent culture, at least that's how we perceive them often in mainstream media. But the reasons for their war were often religious, right? They wanted to gain sacrifices to their god. Yeah, it was more complex than just going to war for war's sake. All right, and then expanding on that, tribute of by conquered groups. So rather than just conquer a group, waylace them, take over their territory, the Aztec would kind of allow their system of governance, the conquered group, to continue. And then they just gain tribute in forms of payments, sacrifices, that kind of thing from the conquered group, and allow them to kind of continue life on otherwise as they normally had. All right, so I'll switch over to the Spanish side here now. Do we know anything about the Spanish, roughly circa 15th century?
They're Catholic.
Catholic, very good. So they're Catholic, so I'm going to put Catholic up here, / monotheistic, right? So going back to that word theistic, and then mono meaning one. Okay, anything else?
They had monarchy.
Monarchy, I like that. So I'm going to put that under a shared category here, because there's a system of hierarchy and royalty in the Aztec society as well, so that's a really good one. So I'm going to put monarchy / hierarchy. Okay. Anything else, guys?
Centralized government.
Centralized government. Yeah, you don't want to put that under both, right? So that's kind of going off of a monarchy. Not all monarchies are entirely centralized, but kind of the whole idea behind a monarchy is that you have one central ruling power, right? Anything else?
Opposite to what you said about the Aztecs, they were very much a naval-based power. I think with Portugal expanding a little bit into Africa before this.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to say vast empire. So I'm going to put empire under both, right? But what I'm going to do is I'm going to differentiate over here and say, a naval power to an extent, and / overseas empire, right? There are obviously some very different circumstances and restraining factors if you want to ruling an empire overseas than one that's land-based you can travel to a little bit more easily, right? Anything else, guys? Okay, so I've got a lot of the ones that you guys came up with. So one god, overseas empire. What I would have put into the Spanish a little bit is war for glory's sake, a little bit. They also fought some religious wars prior to their going overseas. But a lot of their war, like, I mean, colonialism, right? It's war for, wealth, and a lot of times European powers were developing colonies just to kind of keep up, right? It's like a social status thing, right? So war for glory. And exploitation of conquered groups, right? So contrary to what the Aztec did, where they kind of respected conquered civilizations and sometimes incorporated the conquered group's beliefs into their own belief system, the Spanish obviously didn't do that, right? They had a very ethnocentric view, and so exploitation of conquered peoples. That's terrible grammar, but that's all right, that's gonna stick. So I'm gonna skip this Venn diagram portion just for now. But so now that we know that both groups ruled over vast empires, what similarities that we've highlighted may have fueled the expansion of these empires? So what were the similarities that allowed for the expansion of empire under both the Aztec and the Spanish peoples? All right, so one thing I might suggest is that while certainly their warfaring tendencies accumulated wealth, the fact that they were both wealthy kind of to start, or that the Aztec at least lived in a resource-rich environment, kind of enables people to go to war, right? Mercenary work and whatnot like that. It enables a nation to expand more than just focusing on internal efforts, right? A centralized government, obviously, as a centralized government kind of allows you to have a uniform direction. And usually when you have a centralized government, things at home are more taken care of. You're not so concerned about figuring out people's rights. You're kind of more concerned about getting out there and expanding yourself, right? So yeah, I've got feelings of wealth and feelings of cultural superiority. So that's something we kind of discussed a little bit here, but we didn't go over a lot. So oftentimes when people feel culturally superior, we've seen this in history, they feel that they can just go out and expand, and that it's their right and it's their duty sometimes to go out and kind of conquer people, right? So you see that a lot with the Spanish, right? Bringing God to the savage, right? That awful myth that is often perpetuated, or was often perpetuated. And amongst the Aztec, they were also a little bit, ethnocentric, right? They believed they were chosen people, right? It's part of their religious beliefs. Quetzalcoatl is, chosen them, right? They're going to go out and they're going to expand, and God loves them, right? A lot of conquering people tend to think that, God loves us, so we're going to go out and we're going to conquer. It's like a savior-like complex, right? So I'm going to ask another question here. How do you guys think the dominated groups were affected by the rule of the colonizers? So in this situation, how do you think the Aztec were affected by Spanish rule in the New World?
They're like decimated, right?
Largely, yeah. So I think it's safe to say that much of the population in Mexico, what we now call Mexico, was decimated. I mean, certainly some of it survived, but it's similar to maybe what we have in Canada, right, where indigenous populations have drastically reduced, right? Anything else?
Loss of culture.
Loss of culture. I'm gonna write that down over here because that's fantastic, right? Again, parallels can be drawn to multiple societies across the world. After they've been conquered, there's definitely a loss of culture or a replacement of culture, right? Yeah, that's a fantastic one. Steve, you're looking very contemplative over there.
Yeah. I guess one thing that we could be mentioning to expand on decimation was the foreign diseases that were introduced that were responsible for that.
Okay.
Loss of population and culture. They're just unable to fight back because there's a big population drop.
Yeah, okay, so I'm gonna say, let's see, inability to counter the domination. Technologically, medicinally, right, so they have a lot of remedies that certainly were effective for ailments that they were experiencing in their own portion of the world, but nothing that really would counteract the disease that Spanish brought with them. All right, so now I'm gonna ask another question we've kind of touched on already a little bit. What parallels can we draw between the Spanish and the Aztec and say the men and women who colonized Canada, right? So let's say the French or the English who came to Canada, you know, they came as conquerors, as people looking to expand their wealth, and they felt they were culturally superior, and they came to Canada. So what kind of connections might we draw from that?
I'm not too sure about the situation of the Spanish with Catholicism, but religious superiority was certainly there.
Yeah.
But they were trying to spread their religion over the domestic one.
Okay, so I'm gonna say religious over here, loss of culture, because that kind of goes along with domination, right? Loss of culture, so religious loss of culture and beliefs. Anybody else?
Well, I would assume that the original people, or Aboriginal people in Canada had a similar experience to the Aztecs.
Yeah, a similar experience, right? So I mean, you have a foreign group, and I mean, initially, in many cases, it doesn't sound like indigenous peoples or the Aztec were very hostile to, you know, European explorers. That's a cultural difference, you know, guests on the land and whatnot. And then obviously that was kind of taken advantage of in many cases, right? I don't want to speak to all situations. I'm sure there were some hostile groups, right? But yeah, so feeling hostility towards, or generally lack of hostility, sorry, towards new groups. So another one that I've drawn out here is patriarchy. So it has to do with that domination, but it's kind of coming from a place of like stewardship, right? Like we have to take care of them. They don't know what's best for themselves, right? So I think that's very common in a lot of dominated, or you know, colonizer relationships, right? And that's kind of characterized the development of colonies for the last how many years, right? 200, 300 years, especially in the 19th century, right? You look at the British Empire, very much a patriarchal view of what their colonies were, right? There were children, you gotta take care of them. So yeah, the next question is very similar. What does this generally tell us about the relationships between dominant groups and non-dominant groups? So again, we've kind of covered it here already, but we need to be very careful when trying to help those we think are lesser, or you know, going into places, right? Especially if they're different, right? Just because they're different doesn't mean they're lesser. We should strive to understand rather than place our expectations and our beliefs upon somebody else, right? So that's all I think I have time today for. I'm sure I went over.